The United Nations top court has ruled in favor of Somalia over Kenya concerning a maritime boundary dispute. For several years, both countries have locked horns over how to demarcate a disputed area in the Indian Ocean thought to be rich in oil and gas. This is a major decision that could escalate tensions in the region and ultimately reshape the two countries' maritime borders. Somalia argued its maritime boundary should run in the same direction as the southeasterly path of the country's land border. In contrast, Kenya claims that the border should take a roughly 45-degree turn at the shoreline and run in a latitudinal line. This gives Kenya access to a larger share of the maritime area. Apart from fishing, the disputed area, about 100,000 square kilometers, is thought to be rich in oil and gas, which both countries have accused each other of auctioning off blocks before a ruling by the court. The judgment by the International Court of Justice in The Hague handed most of the disputed territory to Somalia, but it also shifted part of the border north a bit, in line with Kenya's demand. The court's rulings are binding but unenforceable, and many countries have chosen to ignore them. Experts say this dispute threatens to inject another note of uncertainty into the strategically vital Horn of Africa, a region already hobbled by terrorism, internal conflict, and widespread instability. Today, we're looking at the implications of the Somalia-Kenya maritime dispute verdict. I'm Tolulokwe Adeleru Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Me is Africa geoeconomic and macro analyst Ali Khan Sachu. He's also the CEO of Rich Management. Ali Khan, welcome back to Business Edge. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So let's go a bit before this particular verdict came into being. So before this reached the International Courts of Justice, there were out-of-court negotiations and dispute resolution that had been tried for a number of years. And then it entered the courts, and even then, Kenya was still pushing for out-of-court negotiations. Take us through what these negotiations look like and why they seem to have fallen through.
For a long time, the Somali government and the Kenyan authorities were negotiating. But really, these negotiations, I think, had been going nowhere fast for a very long time. In part, I think the Kenyan side had a maximalist negotiating position. The Somali government felt that they had a much stronger legal argument and essentially weren't prepared to kowtow to Kenya and therefore took it to the ICJ. You know, there's some talk that Kenya was very lackadaisical in its negotiations, as it turned out to be lackadaisical, if not downright derelict, in not putting an appearance at the court. So the Somali government, I think, were vindicated by taking it to court. But ultimately, I suspect, negotiations will be entered into, because now we have not just the two governments, we have other governments who've got a stake in the oil and gas that you were referring to. It is clear that transactions were done for those fields which are in the sea. So we've got a lot of different players. It's quite a complex geopolitical puzzle. Kenya at the moment, we are encountering a lot of jingoistic talk, which is highly unfortunate, I think, because, jingoism tends to take you not very far.
So we'll talk more about some of the players later on, but this situation, as we've both mentioned, has been on for quite a number of years, over a decade, in fact, and many have seen this as a crucial verdict that has far-reaching consequences for the East Africa region. How important is this particular case in your estimation?
I think, you can't argue with the verdict. I mean, it was pretty compelling. There was a small concession made to Kenya's claim, as you said, but ultimately, from a legal point of view, but obviously global geopolitics is not always entirely legal. There is also leverage and all kinds of other dimensions to it. But from a legal perspective, this is a compelling slam dunk in favor of Somalia. And there is no way, you can dress up as the commander-in-chief, but essentially this has been a significant legal defeat for the Kenya government and its attorney general and the legal authorities.
Well, let's also look at this in terms of the blue economy. For a country like Somalia that has come out of many, many years of civil war, the courts even noted that regardless of the fact that there had been some issues with the government of Somalia, at no time in that period that's been in contention did the country actually cede any of the territory to Ethiopia. And analysts have suggested that this dispute could stretch to Kenya's southern neighbor, Tanzania, could in turn have an impact on Mozambique, Madagascar, and even South Africa in terms of how wide-reaching the consequences are on the blue economy around the Indian Ocean. Do you think it's that far-reaching? Do you think the consequences will sort of become like a tidal wave that has some kind of direct or indirect impact in all of these other countries as well?
It's an interesting point because obviously if you look at the map that you showed at the beginning, if you're drawing that line in the manner that was drawn, you would have a ripple effect on how lines were being drawn further south. But this decision that's been taken by the court is steeped in precedent. So I don't think it's going to impact other countries in the manner that, you're not going to have to redraw boundaries. You're essentially asserting existing maritime boundaries and the law around those boundaries that have existed for a very long time. So some ripple effects, but not as dramatic. It's not a redrawing of the African maritime map in some fundamental way. It's just the assertion of the existing boundaries again.
Seen the tensions between Somalia and Kenya rise and also seen relations between them sour. We saw a cutting of diplomatic ties that was initiated by Somalia. I think it was 2019 that kicked in. But were there any economic actions that were applied in terms of sort of putting pressure on either side to get to the table or to have these conversations? Because when we see these kind of diplomatic tensions, they often come with either economic sanctions on the other party, a banning of maybe imports or exports, things like this. What were the economic pressure points that may have been applied on either side?
So there was no external pressure that was applied that I can see. But what happened was there was a lot of bilateral pressure and responses. So, for example, Kenya banned the export of cat. Kenya grows a lot of cat up here in the Meru area of Kenya and exports it into Somalia, and that was banned. But the nature of these sorts of trade sanctions, the airline flights were blocked for a long time. A lot of the Somali government sit in Nairobi, so it became very difficult for them to operate. Some say pressure was applied to the Somali community, which is in Kenya as well. So yes, there was a lot of tit for tat. But the nature of tit for tat and sanctions of this kind are very counterproductive. Kenyan farmers were the ones who suffered because they couldn't find an export market for their goods. The airline, which is already not really performing, suffered because of cutting off flights to Mogadishu. So, there was no single winner. It was just a show of force that we can inflict pain on you and we can take a lot more than maybe you can. But I think ultimately it was highly ineffective. What is more important, I suppose, is the Kenyan intervention in Somalia, military intervention, and also what's also important is the contribution to stabilization forces that are operating there. But President Farmajo of Somalia has strong allies in President Erdogan of Turkey and also the Emir of Qatar, amongst two that I can mention. And these folks are also players in the wider scheme of things. The Emir of Qatar sent an emissary to Kenya, to Nairobi and Mogadishu. And Erdogan, there was a rumor, was sending gunboats to Somalia's waters in order to defend Somalia from external threats. So you can see how this could spill over and become something much more difficult to manage than it currently is. A lot will depend on the language out of both state houses and how the leaders seek to operate in this new environment post the decision that was introduced by the court.
Very true. So before we go for a break, the maritime dispute is the most visible of some of the issues and tensions that Somalia and Kenya have had in recent times. It's also been noted that the trade imbalance between the neighbors, as well as Kenya's repeated suspension of cross-border trade activities in recent years, and Kenya says this is because of security concerns, have also raised the tension beyond the maritime dispute. But beyond all of this, what is wrong or amiss, you might say, with Kenya and Somalia's economic relationship? Are they able to really push the ties that they have socioeconomically? Or, unfortunately, as it may be, one person is on the losing end with one aspect of it while another gains, and another person is on the losing end with another aspect. How does Somalia gain? Because we can see that obviously they tend to be on the losing end of that socioeconomic relationship with Kenya.
So your point is that Kenya is the big beast in the relationship, and that is a fact. And also, and therefore Kenya tends to throw its weight around, which is also another fact. Some of the data is not shown because there is a lot of trade that goes on between Somalia and Kenya, which doesn't show in the official figures. Eastleigh, for example, which is where the Somali community are in Nairobi, is one of the biggest economies within the city of Nairobi. Looking forward, there is a huge opportunity here. Once Somali stabilizes and returns to a path of growth, there is a huge opportunity for the Kenyan economy and the Somali economies to grow together at a much faster pace than currently. So I would say, look, this relationship has a lot of potential. There's a lot of opportunity. But really, it needs normalization on so many fronts for that potential to be unlocked. I expect it to be unlocked over time, but for now, we're in a phase of jingoism and saber rattling, and everyone wants to, if you look at the media, it's quite extraordinary where we've gone in terms of the comment from what I can see in Nairobi, and I imagine it's no different in Mogadishu.
Please hold on. When we come back, we'll look at some of the allegations that both Kenya and Somalia have made in terms of the oil blocks, the potential for exploration in the area as well, and the big question, what next? Kenya has said it will not recognize the judgment of the International Court of Justice in this maritime dispute. So what happens next? You're watching Business Edge. Do stay with us. Still with me is Ali Khan Sachu, Africa geoeconomic and macro analyst. Now, Kenya has made heavy investments in this corridor in the past few years, including the $23 billion Lamu Port, South Sudan, Ethiopia transport corridor, which has been constructed by the China Communications Construction Company, with the first 3 of the berths, of the planned 32 berths, coming in at a cost of $367 million. Kenya has already granted exploration permits to Italian energy giant Eni, a move Somalia opposed. But Kenya also accused Somalia of selling off oil and gas blocks in the contested area in 2019. So, Ali, my question now is, how does the ICJ's verdict in this situation affect all of the movements and the investments and the people coming in that we're seeing in this particular area?
All look at it from a top-down approach. There was a lot of talk of green energy, but the bottom line is the world is short of oil and gas. Globally, we've seen oil prices rush higher. We've got enormous demand for gas. If you just look at what's happening in Europe right now, there's a tremendous shortage of gas. And the Europeans, from a geopolitical perspective, don't want to have complete dependence on the gas that's coming from Russia. So there's a lot of interest in oil and gas. Talk of this green revolution happening really is gone by the by. The world is short of energy. This is the main resource that's available, and this resource runs from Mozambique, where you had that huge gas find, up through Tanzania, where the new president has woken up to the gas opportunity, whereas Magufuli was just talking the talk, but not doing anything about it. You've seen significant movement there. And this is part of that oil and gas resource stretching through Kenya and up into Somalia. So rich, rich pickings. On top of that, you've got, as you correctly mentioned, the Lamu port. Lamu port is built for much bigger ships than the current Mombasa port can take. And its importance is in servicing those big ships and then moving stuff through the region and moving stuff out of the region. And the idea was it would be an oil and gas hub serving this region, Kenya, Somalia, and potentially even Tanzania and further afield. So absolutely, there are plenty of strands that we've got to look at in the context of this court decision. I think ultimately saner heads will prevail. Somebody's going to come and bang some heads together. Some kind of agreement will be reached. I think Somalia will concede something further than what the court conceded, and hopefully we'll be able to get this show on the road, because really there has never been a more exciting moment to get the show on the road. Whatever Greta Thunberg might say, the world is short of oil and gas right now. There is a massive opportunity for the East African region to try and unlock this. You've already got Total operating in East Africa. You've got Eni very interested as well. So I see a lot of interest, but really you need legal certainty around the prospect in order to unlock it.
So I like that you said that cooler heads will prevail and maybe someone will come along and knock some sense. Who are the people that you think can exert a level of pressure on both parties to maybe go back to the negotiating table? With this verdict, Somalia has a stronger bargaining power now, and Kenya will need to make some concessions, but it's also very likely, as you said, Somalia will also need to make more concessions than what the court has actually granted. So who has the power or the influence on both of them to bring them back to a negotiating table? And in the long run, how do you think this will play out? A 50-50 split of the disputed area, some cooperation? What are we looking at?
So I don't think Somalia, if I was sitting in the State House in Mogadishu, I don't think Somalia's got to give 50-50. I think they've got to, give something like 25%, because their legal position is pretty rock solid. They've got to unlock something for Kenya in order, as a sweetener. But I don't think Somalia is without friends. I mean, Erdogan, 9th biggest economy in the world, Turkey, huge player in Somalia, supported them through thick and thin. He's become a very big player in Africa as well. And they have the experience to help Somalia in unlocking this opportunity. So I suspect someone like Erdogan will be playing the conciliator, and also the Emir of Qatar. Qatar has played a big role in Afghanistan. They're pretty good at reconciliation exercises. They of course brought the Taliban back to the table, reinvented them. But so I think, folks like that. And then you've got the big oil companies, the oil and gas companies who I think would be telling both governments that, if we can unlock this opportunity, you're talking about billions of dollars of cash that can flow into your treasuries at a time when your treasuries need every single coin they can get hold of. So I imagine those are the main players. Norway is another factor in these matters. They're big, and then there's been a lot of support for Somalia through the last 20 years from Western nations. I imagine they're also in the background, nudging both President Farmajo and President Kenyatta along.
All right. So finally, Ali, this whole tension and conflict that has led to the case at the International Court of Justice is about an area that's about 100,000 square kilometers, is thought to be rich in oil and gas. In all of the research, we keep seeing is thought to be rich. What do we know about what has been proven to be in this disputed area? What are the numbers? How long will it take for us to know how much oil is there, how much proven gas reserves are there? Because all of this is tension over this area with what everybody thinks is the economic potential that it holds. So what do we know definitively about that?
So, there has been some seismic research. I mean, people have held it very closely to themselves. It hasn't been shared around. But it's widely recognized that Somalia potentially is the 9th biggest oil and gas country in the world. And Kenya, plenty of disappointment around the Turkana oil find, which really is meaningless because it's too small ultimately. So I think when you look at this, you look at it, let's take something like Mozambique, which was, the 3rd biggest gas find in the world ever. I think, potentially you're looking at something similar. We haven't, it's very, very material, but, because of the civil war in Somalia, people backed off, didn't really do much work around it. But make no mistake, this is a very big find indeed. We haven't touched on the blue economy. Somalia's water and Kenya's are some of the richest in the world, by all accounts. But unfortunately, there has not been the rule of law. So all kinds of people have been bringing their boats and fishing in these waters as well. But it's nothing on the scale of what the oil and gas find will be. Somalia's GDP is tiny when you look at it, but this would make, it's like how Qatar transformed itself, a tiny little place, and suddenly the place is huge, but there's a bigger population in Somalia, but we're talking big, big numbers.
All right, big numbers, not just for Somalia, but big numbers for Kenya as well, depending on how all of this plays out. Ali Khan Sachu, thank you as always. Glad to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right. And it is a conversation we'll be paying attention to because last week, before the judgment, Kenya said it would not recognize the court's judgment, alleging that the judicial process had obvious and inherent bias. It said the judgment would have profound security, political, social, and economic ramifications in the region and beyond. The court has already said Kenya does not have any legal grounds to reject this judgment because it signed up to the court's authority in the 1960s and cannot retroactively renege on that. The question now is, will Kenya accept the ruling? Will this help push Kenya and Somalia back to the table as Somalia now has a stronger position to seek support from the United Nations to seek diplomatic resolution in enforcing or obliging Kenya to uphold this ruling? On the larger socioeconomic and regional ramifications, what happens next? And how will this play out in the region? We'll be continuing this conversation and watching for developments, but what you can watch is NC4 to watch. We'll have a few stories you should keep your eyes out for coming up right now. And here are a few stories we're watching to see how they develop. Now, Zimbabwe's leading industrialists have warned that the country's currency is in danger of collapsing as businesses have to resort to United States dollar transactions. Now, in recent weeks, authorities have arrested scores of foreign traders accused of manipulating the volatile Zimbabwean dollar by trading on the black market. Air Tanzania is launching direct flights to Nairobi, Bujumbura, and Lubumbashi in November, stepping up competition with Kenya Airways, which also serves these routes. The national carrier of Tanzania recently acquired 2 Airbus A220-300 aircraft, raising its fleet of A220s to 4 and boosting its plans to introduce more international routes. The Kenya Revenue Authority has said it will exercise caution before signing an inclusive international framework to reform how multinational tech firms pay digital tax. This follows a recent announcement by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development that significant reform of the international tax system has been finalized to ensure that multinational enterprises are subject to a minimum 15% tax rate from 2023. And finally, an update to a story we covered last week coming from South Africa. The National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, NUMSA, has rejected a new wage offer as a national strike that has already hit output at car maker BMW enters its second week on Thursday. The strike was launched after wage talks hit a deadlock and arbitration failed, with NUMSA demanding an 8% across-the-board wage rise in the first year and inflation plus 2% for the second and third years. The Employers Association had offered 4.4% for 2021, inflation plus 0.5% in 2022, and inflation plus 1% in the third year. And it's a wrap on today's Business Edge. Follow us on social media at News Central TV. And don't forget to download our mobile app so you can take us with you wherever you go. Subscribe to our YouTube channel so if you've missed any of our conversations on the big business, financial, and economic stories coming from here on the continent, you can catch up. I'm Tolulakwe Adeleru Balogun. I'll see you again soon.